There's roughly 6 months to go until the Bitcoin halving, and there's some pretty phenomenal stuff that happens before the halving in terms of Bitcoin price and basically the structure of the market. In this video, let's have a look at what some of the potential insane price targets are for BTC leading into the halving. Now, this is no form of perma bull or moon boy only analysis. We're going to look at the potential downside in the market as well, at least in the short term, before we start to get all googly-eyed at big price targets to the upside for BTC. And of course, if Bitcoin does see these higher prices, that will also mean that altcoins will potentially follow suit. And more importantly, new altcoins that are coming out with the narratives that are present in today and possibly in the next 12 months, which will have the bigger gains compared to the current altcoins or the altcoins of the previous season. Now, if that's all getting a little bit too much for you, don't worry, hit that subscribe button and the like button so that you can stay tuned to your home of macro cycle analysis and of course cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. We are following the real estate and economic cycle here, the 18.6 year leading into a final peak before a mega collapse in the world markets. Now, I've said a lot there. I know I've got a lot to cover. The main thing I want to look at here is Bitcoin and the insane price targets that we are looking forward to over the coming 12, 24 months, possibly even a little bit longer. But first I want to start with some of the short-term stuff so that we can keep ourselves a little bit level-headed here, but not get too fearful into the bearish camp with a lot of analysts and online personalities, traders, investors, whatever, talking about bigger downside. So we just want to have a look at where we're currently sitting. Basically, we've found some short-term support at the $25,000 level, which has basically held up the market for over 6 months now. You can see that we've tested it on 2 brief occasions. And if memory serves me correctly, Bitcoin was basically only under this price for a matter of minutes, if not a couple of hours or so. And it's closed above these levels every single week since March 13th. And it's closed on a monthly basis above $25,000 as well. So there is some strength here, but we're just not seeing the bounce away that we would like to see for a longer term sustained move above the next resistance level, which is around $28,400. So we still have a couple of days to go for the end of the week, or 3.5 days, but for the end of the month, the end of September, which we want to look at in terms of the macro here as we move towards the bigger picture for the pre-halving price targets, this monthly, this whole red September so far, with 2.5 days to go, anything can happen, is still sitting at 2%, positive 2% for September. And some of you guys have pointed out in the videos as well that this is exactly what we were talking about a few weeks ago at the beginning of the month, when we said that maybe September is not going to be as bad as the masses have been telling us based on what they think cycles look like. So look, we can still be wrong. There's 2.5 days. The main thing I want to look at here, of course, is the pre-halving price targets. And I've got a few lines drawn up here on the chart. We want to go through and explain that after we've gone through the shorter term stuff here. So there is still the potential to the downside. 50% level is 23.6. Ideally, we don't, or bulls at least, don't want to see the market on a weekly and monthly closing basis go underneath 23.6. Some dailies here and there are pretty normal, especially for the market, even some wicks down further, but you definitely want to see that market close back above 23.6 if this macro stuff we're looking at when it comes to the pre-halving data and pre-halving price targets is to remain true. We want to see this market continue to consolidate above the 50% level at $23,600 over September, October, and November. Now, we've also got the S&P and the NASDAQ to get through as well with the bigger picture, because that is obviously will sustain the markets longer term as well. These need to be in macro bull markets for Bitcoin to also have its time in the sun through these next 12, 24 months, potentially even longer in this period of the cycle. So I'll look at that in just a moment. But I know obviously we're here to see what these price targets are. Like I said, hit the subscribe button and like this video, because I'm going to be doing more updates of this. This is basically an update of previous halving videos, 4-year cycle videos, as we look at the low in the cycle to the next low. That is your 4-year cycle. Okay, so let's not get too confused when it comes to the halving. So what are we looking at as we move forward in the market? Well, let's start with where we currently sit, and we are in September, ending the month of September. When we get to October, that's going to mean that we are approximately 6 months away from the halving. So the halving is roughly estimated to be about April 2024. Obviously, it all depends on how those blocks are produced for BTC. So that gives us about 6 months. So I want to go back and have a look at what happened roughly 6 months out. I've also got a time frame in mind for when this bull market ends and when it takes off into a retail bull market. So we've got some time frames for that as well. So going back to the previous cycle, 6 months earlier was basically putting in the low. Where we currently sit with 7 months being September, the market in the previous cycle had pretty much was starting that rounded bottom pricing. The low there was 7,300. It got to 6,500, 6,400, and it was basically trying to put in a new higher low before the pandemic hit. So that's your black swan event. And no, there is not a black swan event every single cycle. It seems pretty ridiculous that I hear that quite often, that people are just anticipating another black swan. That's the whole point of a black swan, is you can't anticipate it. And even so, if there was a black swan event, look at what happened when it came to price. So that's the structure of the market. The price that the black swan event, COVID pandemic, got to was only testing the tops of the previous accumulation range. That was the previous bottom in the cycle. The market ran up and was about to put in its higher low and start to move again before the pandemic hit. And then you can see that the bounce was very significant, a beautiful, on a shorter term time frame, a V-shaped recovery, down, straight back up. That's what you want to see if it's a flush out and the weak hands getting out because they are fearful that worse is going to come. It didn't, and the market took off from that point. So keep that in mind. If there is another black swan event, look at the structure and look where the price comes in. 7 months earlier, 6 months earlier, the pricing is potentially, well, it was here rounding the bottom. So maybe we've got something like that coming up as well. Let's go back again, 6 months prior to the halving before that in 2016. The market was again putting in its higher low and rounding that bottom before it started to move higher to test the 50% level. So it's coming up to test around $700. So that was the first test there. It got to the 50% level before the halving. So you can see the top and the cycle low. You split that in half. Obviously this is on logarithmic, so you're going to see the half at a high point. If you put it on linear, half is right there in the middle. So the market came up, tested 50% just before the halving. So it got to that price of $700, which was halfway between the previous all-time high and the cycle low. The last cycle, 2017 bull market, 2018 bear market, you can see that it also got to the 50% level before the halving, well before the halving. So this one was a very explosive move that happened over the course of a few months, whereas the previous cycle, it happened over many, many months, basically a year and a half there from the cycle low to when it tested the 50% level. Whereas this time, straight up, and then basically had to wane out before it started to come up again, to test 50% once again. So I had the first test, came back down, tested it again, little reaction, and then we went off to the races for the retail bull market. Cycle before that, just looking at some similarities here, you can see the market tried to come up and it only tested it once, a small pullback, and then a couple of months later, it's off to the races for the retail bull market. So that leaves us with a couple of questions next. How long is that retail bull market, and how long can we anticipate we have until that retail bull market begins? One way I've tracked it here is just looking at the time frame it took to go from the all-time high, or the previous all-time high, until we had a breakout, a monthly close above the 50% level. So that's November 2016. Basically, about 36 months, basically 3 years at that point. So did it repeat the next year or the next cycle? Almost to the month, 34 months. Remember, these are pretty big cycles. So one might say that 2 months is a pretty big gap here, but you're working over the course of many, many years. And 2 months isn't that much of it's a pretty good tolerance to have for such a long-term time frame. So where was that? You've got a nice close here at you're looking for 50%, 11,464. Clearly October closed above that. You also have a close here in August of 2020 at 11,657. So it did close above it a couple of months earlier as well. So at 32 months, basically 2.5 years, just a couple of months over that 2.5 years. So within that 3-year period from the top, in each of the cycles, we have seen the halving. We've seen a test of the 50% level before the halving, and we've seen a second test of the 50% level roughly around that same sort of time as well. You've got another test here. You've got the halving a few months earlier. We obviously had a pretty big test before the halving. So of course, it's got to break through the 50%. And within that first 3 years, it typically gets to the 50%, tests it, and attempts to break through that. And essentially, it has in each of these occasions and closed pretty well up. Now, the other question was, how long is left in the retail bull market once that 50% level is broken? So that's the 50% of the bear market, okay? So 11,400, you see that first break here in October of 2020. Well, depends how you want to measure it. I know some people say this was the top. Let's just use the true physical top of the market with the highest price, and that was November 2021, 13 months. You could say, well, 12 months is a good time to get out of the market. Basically, there's your break, and there's October. October reached, was almost the exact same price in November before we had the reversal. So, I mean, if you got out in October, you just had to sit out the next 30 days of November and just say it's going to come down from that point. Put aside all of the moon boys telling you it's going to go to 100 grand or 200 grand and just be patient. So if you did stay in the market from the breakout of the 50% into that top of 2021, then you would have been pretty sweet. You basically made the lion's share of the move from the breakout. You took all the profits from the retail investors and then just got out of that market before it came crashing back down. So basically 12, 13 months, you want to use the exact measurements, 13 months going to that final peak. Now the previous cycle, was it similar? Well, obviously I've done the research and it shows up pretty similar. You can see November was the breakout and the close. December was the big move up. So basically like that retail push bar where it closed above everything and started to close in on that all-time high. So we'll take it from October because the true measurements that we're using here is a close above 50%. We want exact rules here so that we can measure. And we measure to the all-time high, 13 months again from that point. But I pointed out that maybe you could go 12 months from that nice big breakout bar in December. So that's this one here, this candle, or the 12 months here. So you'd still get very close to those all-time high prices. But unfortunately, you were out at 10 grand instead of 20 grand. This happened pretty quick. There's no perfection in trading or investing. You just want to try and take the most amount of money from the market that you possibly can. So that wasn't such a bad thing at the end of the day. So we've come up with a few things here, and we can start to project these forward for BTC in this coming cycle. Now, we're looking at a 50% level. We're looking at timeframes of roughly 2.5 to 3 years before that retail market kicks off. And we want to know, well, how much time do we have left to continue to accumulate? So like I said, we covered the short-term stuff. There is the possibility of some short-term downside. So this is not a perma-bull moon boy target price that it has to go there next week, next month, or even in 2023. It doesn't have to happen like that. But we just want to look at, with those few things in mind, can we roughly estimate where the price might be, or at least where the structure of the play might be by around that stage? We've got our 34 months here. Remember, the shortest time frame was around 32, and I believe the longest one was 36. You know, we only have 2 to work with here, but that's what we've got. Let's have a look at that. So we're at 32 months. That takes us out to July 2024. So it's less than 12 months away. So from, let's say from October, because basically we've got 2 days left here, that's going to be 9 months. 9 months to go until we get the final test and breakout of the 50% level. let's have a look at where that next point could be before we look at that 50% level, that price level. 34 months is September, so basically 12 months from now. Or if we go to the longest time frame, 36 months, so it's 3 years from the top, that is November 2024. So like I've pointed out in those previous videos, if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do subscribe. I think 1 out of 4 people aren't subscribed, so go ahead and do that. We've been covering this for obviously months and years, and we want to stay up to date with where these levels are hit and why, so that we can understand the market and not just be some fool in the comment section that's only going one way or the other and has no idea in between. This is how I've come up with this, just looking at the previous cycles as well, and so far so good. They've been working out relatively well. These are 36 months. The previous videos we looked at is somewhere around that sort of May to October area for the market to really start to get hot. And like we've covered on the S&P, that could also be partly due to the S&P breaking to new all-time highs. Now we've looked at the breakdown on price and percentages to the downside for the S&P. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself just yet, because you're hanging out for these price levels, and by now I'm sure hopefully you've opened up a chart and done your 50% level. That price level is around $42,200. So that's a 50% from the bear market. So Bitcoin potentially can hit $42,200 before the halving in April of 2024, because in previous times we've seen Bitcoin hit the 50% level before the halving once, and it got there 1, 2, 3 months just after the halving as well. So the halving was there in May, and it got there that 3rd month after the halving as a retest. So there was one time there that it happened. The previous time, here's the second time, it tested the 50% level 1 month before the halving, and then after the halving, 1, 2, 3 months, it tested it again. So it's really going to depend on whether we get a strong move out of where we currently are to break to those fresh highs, or we're going to see a more of a slower grind, a breakout of accumulations, reaccumulate, a breakout of accumulation level here, reaccumulate, and then that final breakout where you really don't see too much pause in the market before it just keeps running higher. And when that happens, retail bull market is on. When you don't see much of a pullback, that is when the FOMO kicks in, the mania kicks in. That's what most people think of as a bull market, but bull markets start like this. That's why we're saying that this is a current bull market right now, but it's the first stage of a bull market. Yeah, last cycle, we had it for a few months. It took a while from the low in December, January, February, March, then finally April kicked off pretty quick, because I guess people were anticipating slow grinds and breakouts and slow grinds. So they anticipated that, and then it took longer. So you had those slower, longer grinds for a lot longer. This time around, I think people are thinking that was supposed to happen and it didn't happen. And now they're sort of confused. Is it going to be that one? Is it going to be that one? And we're sort of seeing this grinding out period like a reaccumulation zone before we potentially get the breakout. Now with these timeframes and price targets in mind, it can give us a little bit more of an accurate picture and how much time we have left to continue DCAing into Bitcoin if we haven't already started to get in, because yep, there's still a lot of bears that are looking for prices underneath 20,000 or even underneath 15,000. And only recently, last month actually in August, you had all those bears come back saying that 15K was going to get taken out and we're going to go back and test a 12K or 14K, and they're still in the comments. It's still there. So it's possible. Of course, anything is possible. I think it's highly unlikely now, considering where we've come from, how much time we've gone through in the market, especially as we've gone down that 12 months, and now the current first range out of the bull market lasted 8 months to that final peak. That's 8 months to the upside. Never in Bitcoin's history has it recovered 8 months from a cycle low or 8 months from a low and then fallen to a new cycle low. It just hasn't happened. There's too much time to the upside now. So that's why we're in a macro bull market with short-term weakness possible on the cards here, because the market just hasn't pushed up yet. But like we've covered when it comes to the S&P 500, these typically aren't the times in the market that are going to shine to new fresh highs. We've covered the pre-election years. We've covered basically what's going on in the index. This is all part of the overall market, giving us our risk on, risk off appetite in the market. But what comes next, October, November, December, these all look pretty good for the S&P, which might in fact get it to that new all-time high, which, like we've seen in previous Bitcoin accumulation zones, piecing the puzzle together here, you see these Bitcoin accumulations underneath the old all-time high, underneath the 50% levels. The S&P has typically hit a new fresh high, pulled back. I'm not saying we're going to get this huge COVID drop, but then gone up and tested a new high again, a new all-time high. And that's basically when Bitcoin is ready to go to the races for a very short period of time through that whole cycle, like we just covered, approximately 12 months. Here it is again, the previous cycle, 2015, 2016. You can see in the accumulation, this was the time that Bitcoin was underneath its old all-time highs. Here it is breaking, the S&P breaking to new all-time highs. Once it had a pullback, you can count that as a full pullback, and then it tested a new all-time high again, and then Bitcoin is ready to go into its bull market, which lasts approximately that retail bull market, 12 months as it breaks the high. And remember, I'm calling it a retail bull market because that's when things get noisy. Whereas right now, we're not seeing things too noisy because most people are leaving the space or have left the space. They think it's dead. They're saying, call me when it's at 12 grand again. They're going to miss out. And by the time they look back, it's going to be at 42 grand, not 12 grand. Will Bitcoin hit 42,000 before April 2024? Like and subscribe. You know the deal. Links in the video description, all that sort of jazz. I'll see you guys back here for another macro cycle analysis video. Bitcoin, cryptos, stock markets, leaving Milos today, heading to Athens. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well for any sort of updates there. All right, catch you in the next one. Peace out.